There's a version of trust that feels like common sense until the moment it doesn't. You trust the people who sit at your table. You trust the ones who know your coffee order and your doctor's name and which drawer you keep the spare keys in. You tell yourself that kind of closeness is safety. What I've learned at 67 years old in a house I built most of with my own two hands outside of Barrie, Ontario, is that closeness is sometimes the exact mechanism the threat uses to get inside. I want you to sit with that for a moment before I tell you what happened, because I spent most of my life thinking the dangerous things came from outside. Strangers, bad luck, illness. I never once thought to look at the man who carved the turkey at Christmas dinner. My name is Walter. I'm 67. I worked 33 years as a licensed electrician with the same commercial contractor out of Barrie, retired at 64 when my knees told me the crawl spaces were finished with me whether I was finished with them or not. My wife Joanne passed 6 years ago, cervical cancer. We had 14 months between diagnosis and the end, which sounds like a long time until you're living inside it and realize how fast a person learns to say goodbye without using the word. The house has been mine alone since then. 4 bedrooms, a workshop in the back, a garden that gets a little more unruly every summer because Joanne was the one who actually knew what she was doing out there, and I've just been guessing ever since. My son-in-law is a man I'll call by his first name here, Warren. He married my daughter Tessa 9 years ago. They live in Innisfil, about 20 minutes south. He's in insurance. Commercial lines, not personal, which he will tell you is a meaningful distinction. He has a firm handshake and an easy smile and the particular confidence of someone who's been told he's sharp since he was a boy and never once had reason to doubt it. I liked him for years. I want to be honest about that because it matters. Tessa is 38. She has Joanne's eyes and her mother's instinct for organizing everything around her, including, I'm sorry to say, me. She checks in often. She worries about me the way you worry about a house you grew up in that you know needs work, but can't quite bring yourself to sell. It comes from love. I've never doubted that. But love is not the same as judgment, and Tessa has always trusted Warren's. Last September, Warren came to the house on a Saturday afternoon without Tessa. He said she'd sent him ahead. She had a migraine and couldn't make the drive. He brought a casserole in a dish I recognized from our kitchen, which meant Tessa had made it before the headache hit and sent it along anyway. That detail made me feel good. I should have paid more attention to the detail I missed, that he'd come alone and that he was in a very good mood for a man whose wife was lying in a dark room at home. He'd brought a tablet. Not a gift exactly, he said, more of a setup. He'd noticed the old one I had on the kitchen counter was running slow, having trouble with the grandkids' video calls. Drop a connection. He said he'd already wiped a newer one he wasn't using anymore and loaded it with everything I needed. He sat at my kitchen table and walked me through it with patience I didn't know he had. The video call app, the weather, the news. He connected it to my home Wi-Fi. He showed me how to increase the text size. He spent nearly an hour there. Left the casserole and the tablet and a charger and told me to call if I got confused. I used it every day. FaceTimed the grandkids, checked the weather and read the news over breakfast. It was one of the more useful things anyone had given me in years. My friend Norman is the one who changed that. Norman Chisholm and I have been friends since we were 22 years old and working the same job site in Collingwood. He spent 20 years in the Canadian Armed Forces before he came back to civilian life and worked another 25 years in network security for a federal contractor in Ottawa. He moved back to Barrie after his wife retired 3 years ago. We play cribbage on Tuesday evenings at his kitchen table, which is the kind of ritual that sounds like nothing until you realize it's held you together through a great deal. I was telling him about the tablet. Showing him actually, demonstrating the FaceTime function with the kind of pride you feel when you've learned something new that you expected to resist. Norman watched me for a moment. Then he asked me something in a tone I recognized from 40-some years of knowing him. It was his careful voice. The voice he uses when he's already decided something and is working out how to say it. He asked who had set it up. I said Warren. He asked whether Warren had set it up from scratch or whether it had come from Warren's own Apple account. I said I didn't know. I assumed it was fresh. Norman picked up the tablet and held it the way you hold something you're not sure about yet. He went into the settings. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I stopped watching him and looked out the window at the garden instead, which is what I do when I don't want to see a person's face while they're reading bad news. He said, "Walter." Just my name, the way people say it when they need you to pay attention. He showed me the screen. The tablet was still signed into an Apple ID. Not mine. The one it was registered to had been set up with a name I didn't recognize, but the recovery email associated with the account, which Norman had found in the account details, was Warren's work address. I said nothing for a moment. Norman said, "This means he can see your messages, your emails, your browsing. Everything you do on this device syncs to his account." I said, "Can see or has been seeing." He said, "There's no way to know from here how often he checks it, but the access has been there since the day he handed it to you." I drove home from Norman's with the tablet on the passenger seat inside its case, and I made myself not think about it until I got to the driveway. Then I sat in the truck for a while with the engine off and the autumn dark coming down over the yard, and I let myself think about it. I had used that tablet for 11 weeks. I had messaged my financial advisor, Keith Delaney, at the Barry branch of my bank, asking him to pull together a summary of my accounts because I was thinking about updating my will. I had emailed my lawyer, a man named Russ Halton, who I've known for 15 years, about a question regarding the cottage property in Muskoka that Joanne and I had bought in 2001. The cottage had been on my mind because the previous spring I'd mentioned to Tessa, casually, over the phone, that I was thinking about what to do with it long term. Whether to keep it in the family or sell it before the maintenance got to be more than I could handle. The market up there had gone steep. The property was worth considerably more than we paid for it. I had, in other words, used that tablet to have every conversation Warren would have needed to have if he were trying to understand exactly what I owned and what I intended to do with it. I didn't sleep well that night, not because I was afraid, exactly, but because I kept turning over the geometry of it. The year before, Warren had started bringing up the cottage more often. Not directly. He'd mention real estate trends in Muskoka. He'd talk about what a burden seasonal properties were for families to manage after someone passed. Once at Thanksgiving, he'd asked me in front of the whole table whether I'd ever thought about putting it in Tessa's name just to simplify things. I'd said I was in no hurry to simplify anything. He'd laughed and let it go. I hadn't thought about those conversations again until I was sitting in my dark truck in the driveway in September. The next morning I called Norman before 7. He told me to leave the tablet exactly as it was. Use it normally. Don't change the password. Don't sign out of Warren's account. Don't let on. He said those words like he'd said similar things before, which I imagine he had. He told me to buy a new phone on a new account, pay with cash, use only that for anything sensitive until we understood what we were dealing with. That afternoon I drove to the Barry Mall and bought a prepaid phone at the Telus kiosk and activated it in the parking lot. I felt ridiculous. I was 67 years old buying a burner phone like a character in a television program. Then I stopped feeling ridiculous and started feeling something else. A cold, settling clarity. The kind you feel when you've identified a fault in a system and you know exactly where the work needs to start. I called Russ Halton from the new phone. I told him what Norman had found. He went quiet the way lawyers go quiet, which is a particular silence that costs money by the hour. Then he said, "Come in Monday morning. Don't bring the tablet." I went home and stood in the kitchen with the old tablet sitting on the counter. The screen was dark. I turned it on and opened the weather app and looked at the forecast for the week. Rain Thursday, clearing by the weekend. I said out loud to the kitchen that I was thinking of calling the kids about Thanksgiving. Then I made tea and went to bed. Over the following week, I did something that took more from me than I expected. I used the tablet normally. I let myself be the person Warren thought I was. I sent an email to Keith at the bank asking about the process for adding a family member to an account as a joint holder, just to understand the steps. I wasn't going to do it, but I wanted to see whether it produced any reaction. It did. 4 days later, Tessa called and mentioned, very gently, that Warren had been thinking about whether it made sense for them to be more involved in managing things. Not in a controlling way, she said. She used the word supportive. She said they'd been talking to a financial planner who worked with families in situations like mine. Situations like mine. I asked her what she meant by that. She paused the way you pause when you're repeating something someone else wrote for you. She said, "Dad, you're on your own up there and things get complicated. We just want to make sure you're protected." I said I appreciated that and I'd think about it. My voice was steady. I have no idea how. 3 days after that phone call, I found the envelope. Tessa brings the grandkids to visit most Sundays when the weather cooperates. When they come, she uses the small room off the hallway as a temporary office if she needs to take a work call or get the kids settled with a book. I went in on a Wednesday looking for the stapler I keep in the desk drawer. There was an envelope in the back of the drawer I didn't recognize. Plain white, letter-sized, unsealed. My name on the front in Warren's handwriting. I stood at that desk for a long time before I picked it up. Inside were photocopied documents. The first page was a form from the Ontario government. I recognized the header, Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee. Below it was a template for a power of attorney for property. My name was in one of the fields. Warren's name was listed as the attorney. It hadn't been signed, but it had been filled in partially in a way that made clear someone had taken time with it. Behind that was a printed summary sheet. At the top, in Warren's handwriting, Assets, Walter. Below it was a list. The Barry House with an estimated current value I had not shared with anyone in that form. The Muskoka Cottage with a similar estimate. My pension from the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, my RRSPs, a note about the bank accounts. Another note, smaller and at the bottom, that said, Confirm beneficiary designations, Tessa current? The last item on the list, circled twice, said, Cottage, separate title, confirm probate exposure. I put everything back in the envelope. I put the envelope back in the drawer. I went to the kitchen and ran cold water over my wrists for a while, which is something Joanne used to tell me to do when I was too angry to think straight. It works. I don't know the physiology of it. It just works. Then I called Norman. He listened without interrupting, which took discipline because I know him. When I was done, he asked me one question. He said, "Has Warren ever asked you about your will?" I thought about it. Not directly, but there had been a conversation the previous Christmas after dinner when the kids were in the other room. He'd asked whether I'd updated anything since Joanne passed, whether the estate lawyer I used was still practicing. He'd framed it as concern. He was good at framing things as concern. Norman said, "You need to be in Russ's office tomorrow morning, and you need to bring that envelope." Russ Halton sat across from me the next morning and read through the documents twice. He kept his face neutral, which is a professional skill I've always admired. When he finished, he said, "The POA template is legitimate. It's standard Ontario wording. Whoever sourced this knew what they were doing." He paused. "The asset summary is more interesting to me than the form. This is a financial profile, Walter. Someone has been building this for a while." He asked me how comprehensive the tablet access had been. I told him about the emails to him and to Keith. He made a note on his pad. Then he looked up and said something I've thought about many times since. He said, "The reason this works is because it looks like family. to a court, to a bank, to anyone looking from outside, it looks like a concerned son-in-law trying to help an aging widower stay organized. That's the design. He told me 3 things. Document everything with dates and times. Change nothing outwardly. And do not sign anything, no matter how it was presented or who asked. He also said he needed to make a call. The call was to a colleague of his who worked on elder financial abuse files. Not a rare specialty in Ontario, apparently. More common than I'd thought. That was in October. For the next 3 weeks, I lived inside a particular kind of silence that's hard to explain to people who haven't been there. I knew what I knew. I couldn't say it. I had to smile across the dinner table and ask Warren about work and respond normally when Tessa sent me photos of the grandkids. Every single day I went to the kitchen counter and picked up that old tablet and used it like a man who had nothing to hide, which was either the most honest or most dishonest thing I'd ever done, depending on how you looked at it. Norman came over on a Thursday evening and we sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours going through everything I needed to document. He showed me how to keep a time-stamped log in a format that would hold up. He reminded me about something I already knew from 33 years of working in a regulated trade. Paper is stubborn. Paper shows up in rooms that people thought it wouldn't reach. He said, "You're 67, Walter. There are people who will make assumptions about what that means. Paper keeps you in the room." He was right about the assumptions. They came. The weekend before the meeting Russ had arranged, Warren and Tessa brought the kids for Sunday dinner. After the grandkids were in front of a movie in the other room, Warren sat across from me at the dining room table with his elbows forward and his hands folded. I recognized it as a prepared posture. He talked about how much they both loved me, about how Tessa lost sleep worrying, about how the drive up to Barrie in the winter was getting to be a lot and they just wanted to know I had support if I needed it. He was good, genuinely good. The kind of good that makes you understand why people fall for it, because it isn't entirely false. Some of it is real feeling wrapped around a real plan. He said they'd been speaking with a financial planner about family trusts and whether it might make sense, just for simplicity, to consolidate some of the estate planning now rather than leaving everything to probate later. He used the word burden 3 times in 4 minutes. He said he and Tessa had done a lot of research. He said Marion, and then corrected himself, Joanne would have wanted this. He used her name. I looked at him when he said it. I didn't say anything for a moment. There are things that are so precisely aimed that they take a breath to absorb. Joanne would have wanted this, as if he knew what Joanne would have wanted, as if Joanne were a lever he was entitled to use. I said I'd need some time to think, that I appreciated them looking into it. My voice was even. I don't know where that comes from, that particular stillness under pressure. I learned it somewhere over 67 years and I've never been more grateful for it. He placed a folder on the table before he left. Clean documents, freshly printed, my name at the top. The kind of presentation that says someone has done this before. I called Russ from the prepaid phone before their taillights were out of the driveway. He said, "That's exactly what we needed." The meeting was at Russ's office on Collier Street on a Tuesday morning in early November. Russ had told Warren and Tessa it was a routine estate planning review, which was true in the narrowest sense. He'd suggested they come together, which they did. Tessa wore her good coat. Warren carried a leather portfolio and looked like a man who expects a conversation to go the way he's scripted it. Constable Anika Ferreira from the Ontario Provincial Police was already in the room when they arrived. She was in plain clothes. She introduced herself as part of an ongoing review of a financial matter. Warren's eyes went to me when she said the word financial. I was looking at the surface of the table. My hands were flat on it. Still, Russ opened by reviewing the tablet. He explained, in a language that was legally precise and therefore impossible to mischaracterize, what Norman had found. He explained what the device had been used for and what information had been accessible through the account it was registered to. He placed a printed report from a certified digital forensics consultant on the table. The consultant had reviewed the device at Norman's recommendation and documented everything. Warren said, "I set that tablet up as a favor. I had no idea the account was still active." Russ placed a second document on the table, a screenshot of the account login history, showing access from an IP address registered to Warren's home network 11 separate times over the previous 10 weeks, including the morning after I had emailed Keith at the bank about the joint account inquiry. "The room held that for a moment," Russ said. "We also have the envelope." Tessa looked at Warren. It was a specific kind of look. The look of someone reassembling something they thought they understood. The photocopied power of attorney template was placed on the table, the asset summary sheet beside it. Russ pointed to the note at the bottom. Cottage, separate title, confirm probate exposure. Warren said, "Those are notes, planning notes. I was trying to help." Constable Ferreira said, "Planning notes that include a detailed financial profile of Mr. Kendrick's assets, compiled without his knowledge or consent, alongside a partially completed power of attorney naming you as the attorney for property." She said it without heat, just the shape of it. Russ placed one more document on the table. It was a printed email chain, obtained with my permission from my account, between Warren and an estate lawyer whose office was in Barrie. I won't describe the contents in full, but there was a line in one of Warren's messages that described the cottage property as likely the most efficient asset to move first, given the title structure and the old man's age. He had written "old man" without apparent self-consciousness. Tessa made a sound I recognized, her mother's sound, the sound Joanne made when something landed harder than she expected. Warren tried. He was composed for longer than I expected. He talked about genuine concern. He talked about watching me struggle, his word, with the house and the finances and the isolation. He said the documentation was just responsible planning and that any misunderstanding came from poor communication. He said Tessa knew how worried he'd been. He looked at her when he said it. Tessa was looking at the email on the table. Warren said, "Joanne would have wanted Tessa to be taken care of." He was still looking at his wife when he said it. I spoke then. The first time I'd said anything since they'd sat down, I said, "Joanne spent 31 years making sure everything we built would last. She trusted me to protect it. I planned to do that." I wasn't angry when I said it. That surprised me. I thought the anger would come out in my voice, but it didn't. It came out in the steadiness, the refusal to shake. Warren sat back down. He didn't say anything else. Constable Ferreira told Warren that she would be in contact with him directly, and that he should consider retaining his own counsel. She said it with a professional flatness that was, in its own way, more frightening than anger would have been. There was no handcuffing in a conference room, no dramatic scene. He and Tessa left separately. I watched them walk out of the building from the window in different directions toward different cars, which told me something about the conversation that was already starting between them. I stayed with Russ for about 20 minutes after. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was all right, which was mostly true. He walked me out to the parking lot, and we stood there in the November cold for a moment, that particular gray Ontario cold that settles in like it owns the place. I drove home through Barrie on roads I've driven for 40 years. Past the job sites I helped wire, past the hospital where both my kids were born, past the street where my parents' house used to stand before the lot was redeveloped. The city was the same as it always is. I was not quite. Tessa called 4 days later. She had been crying before she called, I could tell. She told me she hadn't known about the email. She hadn't known what he'd called me. She said she'd believed him when he said he was worried, that the concern had felt real to her, that she'd trusted his version of things because she'd had no reason not to, and because the fear of losing me the way she'd lost her mother, had made her more willing to let him lead. She said, He knew exactly what to say to me, Dad. He knew exactly where I was scared. I believed her. I want to be clear about that. The belief wasn't the hard part. The hard part was understanding that belief isn't the same as repair. We're still working on it. It's a different kind of conversation than we used to have. More careful, on both sides, which maybe isn't entirely a bad thing. Some structures need to come down before you can see what the foundation actually looks like. Within 2 weeks of the meeting, I had changed every account password, reviewed every beneficiary designation, and worked with Russ to update my estate documents with a trustee arrangement that was completely independent of Warren or any connection to him. Russ also recommended I speak with the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee about filing a notification, given the partially completed OA as a precautionary record. I did that. The woman I spoke with at that office was matter-of-fact and thorough and told me they heard cases like mine more often than most people would imagine. Norman came for dinner 2 weeks after the meeting. We ate at the dining room table, which I'd been avoiding in a vague way since Joanne died. Something about that night made it feel right to sit there again. He brought a butter tart from the bakery on Dunlop Street because he knows I have a weakness for them, and he believes food is a reasonable form of condolence. After we ate, he sat back and said, "You know what the strangest part of all this is?" I said, "Tell me." He said, "You had to pretend to be less than you are for 3 weeks so that the people underestimating you would keep going long enough to finish themselves." I thought about that. He's right. There's a particular cost to performing confusion when you're not confused, to performing frailty when you're still standing. It doesn't leave a visible mark, but it lives somewhere in you afterward. In the quiet moments, the tablet is gone. I have a new one, set up in my own name, on my own Apple ID, which Norman walked me through personally, and then reviewed again the following week to make sure nothing had been missed. It took about 40 minutes, which I mentioned, because 40 minutes is apparently how long it takes either to wire a trap or dismantle one. The cottage in Muskoka is still mine. I drove up there in late November after the season had ended and most of the lake had gone quiet. I sat on the dock in the cold for about 20 minutes, looking at the water and the tree line on the far shore, which has barely changed in 20 years. Joanne and I used to bring the kids up here in the summer. Before that, we came alone, when we were still young enough to think property ownership was romantic rather than an obligation. I thought about what Warren had written. Most efficient asset to move first. Like it was a piece on a board. Like the 30 years of driving the 400 north and the 10-year-old who caught her first fish off this dock. And the evenings Joanne and I sat out here until the bugs drove us in were all just a title structure and a probate exposure. I stayed until the cold told me it was time to leave. Then I drove home. Here's what I'll tell you plainly, because I think you've earned the plain version after sitting with me through all of this. At 67, I thought the hard years were behind me, the building years, the loss years. I thought what was left was mostly maintenance, staying mobile, staying connected, not becoming a burden to the people I love. What I learned is that the risk doesn't retire when you do. It changes shape. It starts wearing the faces of people who've been in your house. It comes with casserole dishes and tablet computers and folders full of documents that are technically just planning notes. If someone in your life has started paying very close attention to what you own, how much it's worth, what your accounts look like, and who's listed on them, not in the way people who love you pay attention to your well-being, but in the way people who are building a file pay attention to assets, trust that discomfort you feel. Write it down. Call a lawyer before you call a family meeting. Make sure the people who have access to your home and your devices and your paperwork have that access because you gave it to them clearly, not because they arranged to have it. Your home, your pension, your savings, your right to decide what happens to things you spent a working life building, those are worth the trouble of protecting. and protecting them is not the same as not trusting the people around you. Real love does not need a power of attorney signed over the dinner table. It does not need access to your email. It does not need a file with your cottage's title structure written down next to the phrase probate exposure. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story felt familiar in some way, please don't keep that to yourself. These things move in the dark, and they stop when people shine a light on them. Share this with someone who might need to hear it. Stay steady out there. Take care of yourselves.